6 Democratic presidential candidates took the stage last night for the final debate before the Iowa caucus. Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and Tom Steyer spent most of the first hour talking about foreign policy, impeachment, healthcare, and more. But the moment that gained the most attention of the night was the feud between Senators Sanders and Warren. Following a report, Sanders had told Warren in a 2018 meeting that a woman could not win the presidency. Here's what they said when asked about it.
Senator Sanders, I do want to be clear here. You're saying that you never told Senator Warren that a woman could not win the election.
That is correct.
Senator Warren, what did you think when Senator Sanders told you a woman could not win the election?
I disagreed. Bernie is my friend, and I am not here to try to fight with Bernie. But look, this question about whether or not a woman can be president has been raised, and it's time for us to attack it head on. And I think the best way to talk about who can win is by looking at people's winning record. So, can a woman beat Donald Trump? Look at the men on this stage. Collectively, they have lost 10 elections. The only people on this stage who have won every single election that they've been in are the women, Amy and me.
And for more on this, I want to bring in CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns, who's in Des Moines. Hi, Caitlin. You were at the debate last night. At the end of the debate, it appeared Warren refused a handshake from Sanders. Can you explain to us what happened there?
Yeah, so going into this debate, we were trying to figure out what happened in that conversation with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders in 2018 that spurred this whole thing. And at the end of the night, we're trying to figure out what that conversation was between the two of them on the debate stage. You saw that handshake or non-handshake that is now raising new questions about whether this relationship has in fact frayed to the point that this will continue to become an issue. During the debate, the two senators appeared to suggest that they don't want to escalate this feud any further, but that non-handshake may raise some more questions about this. A couple of things to consider when we're looking at Bernie Sanders versus Elizabeth Warren. On the debate stage last night, Bernie Sanders was clear that he believed that he did not say that a woman couldn't win. He referenced past times that he has said a woman could be president, and he cited Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote in 2016 by 3 million votes. Elizabeth Warren used that exchange last night to talk about the issue of gender and electability, something that we've been talking about over the course of this campaign, especially as voters really start to assess the candidates. We saw Elizabeth Warren say that both of the women on stage had won all of the elections that they ran in, and she couldn't say the same for the men on the stage. Afterwards, the Warren campaign was fundraising off that question, signaling that they want to kind of continue to make this something that might galvanize supporters. And that's the question that I have, is kind of how this plays out for both of these candidates. Do supporters of Elizabeth Warren, or those who might have thought that they would be interested in her, are they more inclined to turn out because of the issues that she raised on that stage with Bernie Sanders? Or do Bernie Sanders supporters feel more galvanized and less inclined to switch over to Elizabeth Warren because of this as well? Could it backfire for either of them? That's what we're going to be assessing as we talk to voters in places like Iowa over the next coming weeks. What is clear, though, is that progressive outside groups and those who want to unite the progressive wing of the party don't want these two to be feuding. Instead, they want to focus on candidates like Joe Biden.
But to have been a fly on that podium during that non-handshake to hear what those two were saying, right, Caitlin?
Exactly.
All right. So recent polling in Iowa shows a very close race between the top 4 candidates. You have spoken to voters in Iowa. What do people who are undecided say they're watching for?
Yeah, that's why last night's debate could be critical, because it was the last one before voters actually head to the caucuses. And just 19 days from now, we're going to see candidates who can be here as much as they can. And that's something that I'm looking for over the next couple of weeks as well. Remember this impeachment trial that we've been talking about that will now get underway in the Senate really figures to throw a wrench in a lot of these plans for Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Amy Klobuchar, who were counting on on being here in Iowa instead of in Washington. That could help boost candidates like Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden, who can have Iowa to themselves, who can kind of distance themselves perhaps from the divisiveness going on in Washington and speak to issues that voters here care about. We know that the senators who are going to be back in Washington have plans to do as much as they can from Capitol Hill, whether that means phoning in or doing virtual town halls, sending surrogates out to the campaign trail. But you can imagine that this really adds to the challenge for them, and it's something that we just haven't seen in a presidential race before.
Caitlin Huey-Burns in Iowa, thank you so much. And for more on this, I want to bring in CBSN political contributor Molly Hooper and CBS News political contributors Leslie Sanchez and Antjuan Seawright. Leslie's a Republican strategist, Antjuan's a Democratic strategist. All right, so let's get into this. Molly, talk to us a little bit more about the feud between Senators Sanders and Warren. I mean, it's interesting to see the gloves come off at this point.
Well, it is, and I've kind of been waiting for it because it's sort of one of these little secrets that people know up on Capitol Hill. But even though, people say on the surface, oh, we're really good friends, underlying there's a little bit of competition, and that you can say that about Bernie and Elizabeth, because even though they do agree on a lot of issues, doesn't necessarily mean that they are as buddy-buddy as one would think.
Right.
And so this has been simmering under the surface for a long time, and there had been this détente, so to speak, that they wouldn't go after each other, but man.
Antjuan, do you want to weigh in on that?
So
as
I
the
think
Democratic
the timing of this is so interesting. I mean, this conversation happened in 2018. Here we are, a day before the Iowa debate, the last debate before the first contest in which the race is neck and neck, that the information was leaked. And then there were several other leaks followed up from the Sanders campaign, and there was a lot of back and forth. And I think it's really just a fight for who can take up the most space in the progressive lane on the political highway. I thought Bernie's response obviously was a lot different than Elizabeth Warren's response, because he said he did not say it, and she said, yes, he said it, but she didn't buy into it. And she used it, I think, a moment that could transfer into an energetic movement for her going into the Iowa caucus.
All right, Antjuan, I just want to stick with you for 1 second, because as you know, we just saw the articles of impeachment voted to be sent over to the Senate. This could begin next week. We've got senators running for president. Are they in a good position right now to continue the momentum of their campaigns while this trial is going on?
I definitely think it's going to have a tremendous impact, particularly for an on-the-fence candidate like Senator Amy Klobuchar, who is gaining some momentum, but I think it's going to have impact on her ability to keep communicating with voters. Luckily for her, she's now visited every county in Iowa, so people know who she is. But if she does not have the resources to put together a strong air game, it's going to have tremendous impact. And for Senator Sanders and Senator Warren, I definitely think it's going to have an impact for them, because they're fighting neck and neck with Mayor Pete and Vice President Biden, who do not have the same responsibility.
Let's talk about, Leslie, is this the advantage then for, Biden and Buttigieg? Does this mean that,
they're out there on their own?
Yeah.
Well, a good question, and I thought about it for Caitlin particularly. When you're talking about this close to the end, there's the percentage of people that are undecided gets smaller and smaller. So what's that percent of people who are undecided? And that's really the question in terms of small numbers moving back and forth. So if you're already a Biden person, regardless of what you said, you're going to turn out on a cold, windy, rainy day to caucus, which is a tremendous amount of time, and it's a sacrifice, and it's part of the right and the duty they have. People get excited in Iowa to be able to do that. But if you're somebody who was already for Bernie Sanders, you're still going to be for Bernie Sanders. On the progressive side, there's one really interesting key there. Hillary Clinton had an issue, particularly when it came to women, that her female voters, there were many of a certain generation who wanted to see that first female candidate win, right? And for decades, they'd been struggling to get the qualified candidate who could raise the money. Hillary Clinton was this. And they were really disgruntled and upset at younger women who said, no, I'm going to vote, in 2008 for the best candidate, Democratic candidate, regardless of gender.
Right.
When you trigger, I think that was a trigger point that Warren did strategically, shrewdly to some extent, and now she's fundraising on it to activate this group of women who are very loyal Democratic primary voters to say, look, it's the same old boys game. here's an opportunity. He is of that.
Right. This
ilk.
conversation isn't over. We're still having this
So
conversation.
if you're deciding between the two of us, I represent really the future of progression.
That was true.
The progressive movement.
Bernie is well positioned out of all of the senators who will be in Washington, D.C. is most well positioned to do well because he's been through a caucus before. And the margins were so close in 2016 with Secretary Clinton. And say what you want about Bernie Sanders, but his following, unlike many other candidates, are very loyal people. And in an expected record turnout in the Iowa caucuses, loyalty is going to matter. And if you've ever been a part of the caucus process, thankfully I have, things can shift very quickly. How you start the day may not end up how you end up the day. And with 1,600, I think, counties or locations across the state of Iowa, it's going to be an interesting thing. And I think that Bernie stands out of anyone to have the biggest advantage out of the senators who are on the stage.
The other thing that happens is once they start attacking each other, like what Molly is talking about, it does give opportunity for people like a Klobuchar, who is not being attacked just on the outside. It's almost the last woman standing. We've seen that phenomenon before. We don't know that that would be the case here, but it does change that, like the political dynamic in those early states.
Well, I want to turn now to foreign policy because, as the president is wont to do, he held a competing event in Milwaukee last night during the Democratic debate. Foreign policy was addressed on both stages. Let's listen to what the president had to say about the strike on General Soleimani.
A few days ago, we took bold and decisive action to defend American lives and deliver American justice. At my direction, the United States military launched a flawless precision strike that killed the world's number one terrorist. You know who that is? Qasem Soleimani, number one terrorist in the world.
All right, so Leslie, is the Democrats' messaging on foreign policy strong enough to counter the president's messaging?
Not at this time. To say I needed to see more evidence, I would have hesitated. I don't know. In some cases, it was so extreme on the progressive side to sound like apologists. That's not the stance, I think, that you have, particularly with voters who perhaps were Democrats that voted for
To be fair, Antjuan, really quickly, do you want to weigh in before we move on?
Yeah, because I do think there's bipartisan outcry about how this went down. That's why you see Democrats and Republicans saying you should have come to Congress first. And the concern was not what the president did, it's what happens next. And as a result, we don't know what next may be. And from all the evidence we've seen, we had Republicans come out of committee meetings saying they were not convinced based on what they saw that this was a real threat. His own defense secretary on Face the Nation talked about there was no real threat to the embassies that they knew about. So the math just does not add up.
We are out of time. Antjuan, Seawright, Molly Hooper, Leslie Sanchez, thank you so much for joining us.